Is this it then? It's not exactly a crisis. We're not in the sell everything up and buy a motorbike territory. It's more like the fog lifts for a second, and suddenly you see the shape of your life exactly as it is. All the routines, the compromises you've made, all the bits you meant to sort out 5 years ago, and will probably wait another 5. And I guess that's what this episode is about. It's that strange midlife recalibration that men go through. So, let's get into it. Welcome to The Quiet Midlife. I'm Jerry Kennard, retired psychologist and someone who's spent a career thinking about how men's minds work. In this episode, I'm taking on the issue of midlife reappraisal because it's one of the more significant psychological transition in a man's life, and it's probably the one he's least prepared for. By the end of the episode, you'll understand what's driving the shift, why the standard responses to it tend to make things worse rather than better, and what the research says about how to navigate it in a way that produces something genuinely useful, rather than that second-hand sports car and pair of leather trousers you've been looking at. You will be interested, I suspect, in the fact that the term midlife crisis was coined by a psychologist, Elliot Jacques, in 1965. He'd actually written a paper looking at the lives of artists and composers and the changes in their creative output from around the age of 35. It quickly entered popular culture with considerable enthusiasm and naturally acquired a set of stereotypes. For example, the sports car, the affair, the sudden strange interest in motorcycles, and in so doing it managed to obscure more than it illuminated. The problem with the idea of a crisis is that it always implies that something's gone wrong. There's an aberration. It's something to be managed or minimized or got through as quickly as possible before returning to normal service. What the research tells us is a bit of a different story. What the midlife period actually involves for most men isn't a crisis, but a kind of developmental transition, a normal, predictable stage of adult psychological development that's been recognized across cultures and throughout recorded history. Midlife reappraisal is actually driven by several converging forces that, like buses, have an unfortunate tendency to arrive simultaneously. So let's tick them off one at a time. The first, not necessarily in any particular order, is mortality awareness. Now, at the age of 25, death is pretty abstract. At 45, it becomes considerably more concrete, and that's because we have an awareness of our own age. Perhaps your parents have aged or died. Contemporaries have been diagnosed with sometimes quite serious illnesses. And your body, well, it's begun to demonstrate with irritating persistence that it's not the inexhaustible resource it once appeared to be. The psychological effect of genuine mortality awareness, as opposed to the intellectual knowledge that death really does exist, changes your relationship with time, with priorities, with the question of what actually matters. The things that seemed urgent in the accumulation phase of life, status, achievement, career advancement, they begin to feel less compelling. The things that were deferred, relationships, meaning, genuine engagement with life, they begin to press a bit more insistently. The second driver is the gap between aspiration and reality. At midlife, the window for certain possibilities has visibly narrowed. Your career trajectory, once something of a mystery, has become so much clearer. And for many men, this assessment produces a complex picture of genuine satisfaction and sometimes genuine loss. And the loss is the one that tends to get less attention than it deserves. The third driver is identity questions that resurface with a force that surprises most men who thought they'd settled that matter decades ago. The roles that have structured adult life, the role of provider, professional, husband and father, are either changing or they're approaching their end dates. Children are becoming independent, career trajectories are plateauing or shifting, and the question of who you are is no longer theoretical. The midlife reappraisal isn't your mind malfunctioning, it's your mind doing exactly what it's meant to do at this point of life. It's taking stock, it's reassessing, it's nudging you towards whatever should come next. Now, whether that's useful depends entirely on what you do with it. The range of responses to midlife psychological pressure is really quite broad, and not all of them are equally sensible. At one end is the dramatic exit, the affair, the sudden resignation, the impulsive major purchase, the abrupt life overhaul. These responses share a common logic. It's about the discomfort of the reappraisal being treated as evidence that current life is wrong. And the solution? Well, that's to replace it with a significantly different version. Can it work? Well, maybe it can occasionally. More often it transplants the same psychological questions into an entirely different setting, with the additional complication of collateral damage to relationships, finances, and other people's lives. And the questions don't go away, they just go underground, and they bubble up against later with more force and probably less convenient timing. What the research and clinical experience consistently suggests works better is something less dramatic and perhaps a bit more demanding. Engaging with the questions that arise rather than fleeing from them or suppressing them, and that means allowing the reappraisal to happen, sitting with the discomfort of unresolved questions, all about meaning, identity, and direction, rather than trying to convert them into action or distraction. It means examining what's genuinely satisfying about current life, what isn't, rather than making some kind of wholesale judgment in one direction or the other. It means being honest with yourself, possibly with others, about what matters to you and what really doesn't. One aspect of the midlife reappraisal that receives insufficient attention is grief. Specifically, that kind of griefs for the paths that you haven't taken and at the possibilities that have closed off for you. At 45, it becomes so much clearer that certain things just aren't going to happen. The career didn't take the expected shape you were hoping for, perhaps. The relationship that ended, or perhaps never began. The version of yourself that you were going to become eventually. They're actually real losses, and they deserve to be acknowledged as such, rather than just dismissed as some kind of self-indulgent. Men in general aren't terribly well equipped for this kind of grief. The permission to mourn, as it were, is not taken widely to an extent by adult men. And the internal response to unexpressed grief, well, that tends to tip towards irritability, a kind of diffuse anger without a clear object, or even a slip into depression. The man in his late 40s who's mildly but persistently unhappy without any obvious cause could be carrying unacknowledged grief for a version of his life that simply isn't going to happen. And it's a normal human response to genuine loss. It tends to respond well to being recognized as such. We're actually going to spend the whole of episode 8 on the subject of grief in men, how it presents, why it's different from the standard picture, and what actually helps. But for now, the relevant point is this. The midlife reappraisal always involves some kind of grief, and the men who navigate it best are those who allow themselves to acknowledge it rather than manage it in silence. The picture of midlife in the research literature is considerably more nuanced than the popular narrative of crisis followed by decline. The large-scale Midlife in the United States study, which is one of the more comprehensive longitudinal studies of adult development, found that midlife is for most people a period of high functioning, relatively high levels of life satisfaction, good psychological well-being, and a good sense of control and social responsibilities. It's better than the period of misery that the crisis narrative implies, and it also found significant individual variation. Midlife is not uniformly difficult for people. The men who experience it as a significant psychological struggle tend to have a specific risk factor. They have high work centrism, they have poor social support, and they tend to have avoidant coping styles and a self-concept that's built primarily around roles that are inevitably changing. The U-shaped curve of life satisfaction, which is high in youth, dipping in midlife, and rising again later in life, has been replicated across several studies and different cultures. What it suggests is that the midlife dip is temporary, and for most people it's followed by a period of genuinely increased well-being. It's not inevitable, and it doesn't happen without effort, but the general trajectory for men who engage with reappraisal rather than avoiding it is generally upward. So, the midlife reappraisal isn't a problem to be solved so much as a process to be engaged with. The following questions aren't intended to be a therapeutic exercise, but they are an invitation to think deliberately about territory that most men navigate by accident. First, what am I doing because I chose it, and what am I doing because I drifted into it? Not everything needs to change, but knowing the difference between chosen commitments and accumulated defaults is useful information. Second, what have I been deferring and why? The things consistently pushed to later relationships, interests, health, conversations tend to have reasons attached to the deferral that are worth examining. Third, what would I do differently if I was starting now with what I know? It's not a question about regret, it's a question about current priorities disguised as a historical one. Fourth, what losses haven't I properly acknowledged? And I don't just mean bereavement, but the quieter losses, the career that went differently to the way you imagined, the relationship that ended, the version of yourself that you were supposed to be. And fifth, what actually matters to me, as opposed to what I've been acting as though matters. These are frequently quite different lists, and the gap between them is often where the discomfort lives. So, while a midlife reappraisal is a perfectly normal process, it can sometimes slide into depression or anxiety, and that warrants professional support. So the mind during midlife is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It's taking stock of what's been, it's assessing what remains, and it's nudging you, okay, sometimes uncomfortably and inconveniently, towards what might come next. There's no point in trying to outsmart the process by staying busy or finding ways to avoid it. All the evidence points to the fact that the men who come through it well are those who engage with the questions that arise. The answers may not always be perfect, and sometimes they remain unanswered, but it's a remarkably simple process. For the process to be effective, I think you must try to avoid black and white thinking, because A, it's too easy to fall into that trap, and B, life is much more nuanced. So questions like, is my life a failure, or should I have done things differently? They fall squarely into the black and white trap. What's happened has already happened, and perhaps a more nuanced question would be, given everything I know now and looking to my future, what do I do with it? Now, that's not crisis thinking. It's something, if approached honestly and with a little courage, allows you to weigh up your options. It might also be the beginning of that new chapter you've heard about, the one that pulls the story together and leads to an interesting set of conclusions. Next episode, I'm taking on the issue of men and grief. I'll be tackling questions as to why men grieve differently, what grief in men looks like, and why the loss that goes unacknowledged tends to be the most costly of all. If you've lost someone recently, or even a long time ago, and the experience didn't turn out the way you expected, well, maybe that's an episode for you. Until next time, take care of yourself. Oh, and if you haven't already, maybe it's time to sit down with one of those midlife questions that's been pricking away at you. Bring it to the surface. Acknowledge it's there. You're not required to answer it immediately, but it might just be the start of something interesting. I'm Jerry Kennard, and you've been listening to The Quiet Midlife.